I'm Alex Vatanka, Senior Fellow and Director of the Iran Program at the Middle East Institute. And I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's event, US and Iranian Strategies for a Biden Administration. With the election of Joe Biden as the next president of the United States, Tehran is faced with the opportunity to seek a much different relationship with the US. The Biden administration is already expressing interest in salvaging what is left of the nuclear deal from 2015 and pursue the resumption of a diplomatic track between US and Iran. Within Iran, there's already a policy fight underway about the future of US-Iran relationship. President Hassan Rouhani has about a half a year left in office and is desperate for the US to return to the deal and remove the sanctions. You could in fact argue that his legacy will very much depend on the next US steps in the Biden administration that's just around the corner. No doubt the incoming Biden team will know all about Tehran's economic pains when it comes to take over on the 20th of January. But the question is whether Washington will opt to quickly roll back sanctions first and then broaden the conversation to Tehran, or use the Trump sanctions as leverage to first reframe any future talks with Iran. Today, I'm pleased to welcome a group of experts who will discuss policy competition in Tehran and other key challenges in the path of US-Iran relations in the coming Biden administration. First, I would like to welcome John Alterman. John is the director of the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, DC. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Hana Kaviani. Hana is a journalist at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Persian language service, known as Radio Farda. And finally, I would like to introduce Behnam Ben Taleblu. Behnam is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. To submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching on our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email also events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout this 1 hour long panel. I'll be looking at all of your questions and will factor in as many into the discussions as possible. With that said, let me go back to our panel. And I'm just going to start with Hana. Hana, you are following obviously the Persian landscape very closely. What's being said, what's being done in terms of the last few weeks since the US elections were held. I thought I wanted to ask you, first describe the mood in Iran about the US elections. We know how important they were, but I was somewhat taken back perhaps by how many people in Iran and in the Iranian diaspora were supporting President Trump's re-election. And I don't think it has obviously anything to do with President Trump pursuing policies at home, but the hope that so many Iranians had that Trump would finally change the nature of the Islamic Republic. And now with his defeat, where do we stand? Where's the public mood like in Iran?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. It's a very interesting time, and obviously for Iranians, it has been a very exciting, in a sense, 2-3 weeks following the US elections, the days we were heading towards the elections day, the counting of the vote, and now the days after. Honestly, I have to say, I'm a journalist sitting in Prague, and what I follow, it's through our reportings, through our contacts inside the country, very importantly, our audience, which leave messages for us. And also, I obviously look at a lot what happens on social media and Persian social media sphere. If I want to answer this question, I would say I had 3 main groups observing this whole situation. I would say, yes, there were those who were really hoping for a second Trump administration, continuation of the maximum pressure campaign, with the hope that this maximum pressure campaign would result in a change, whether that is a change in the behavior of the Islamic Republic or the change of the regime itself as a whole. But Iranian society, like any society, is quite a diverse society, as you well know. And I would add another group, which were those who were hoping for a Biden administration to come in. And this, when I talk about this group, I don't mean that these are necessarily supporters of the Islamic Republic. These are people who are very well aware of the mismanagement, of the corruption, of the human rights abuses, but at the same time, the hope of an opening, of a lessening of sanctions maybe, would be more desirable to them. And they were also following very closely what was going on in the US in the past weeks. Obviously, there is a third group in Iran which have a certain way of thinking when it comes to the US. They don't want any negotiations. Animosity is something which is more desirable to them. But even among those people, I was seeing a lot of interest of following what happens in the state, how this develops. And honestly, in my time covering Iran and looking at Iran, I never saw this amount of anticipation and excitement and curiosity about what happens in the US. And people were joking about the way they learned about the geography of the United States by following state by state and different counties and different cities, how it goes on. So it is important for the Iranians as the population I'm talking about, but also the mood in Tehran when talking about the state, the officials, the government, office of the supreme leader, how they looked at it was, I have to say it was not surprising, because the days that we were heading into the elections, there was this talk of, yes, there might be a change, but it is irrelevant to us when thinking about what the supreme leader of Iran was talking about. But after the results started to come in, we saw the same kind of narrative, but when it comes to the government of Hassan Rouhani, it started to smoothen a bit. Even Rouhani went up to the point that a few days ago he said, national interest is the most important thing, and those who would miss the opportunity of negotiations, if it's for the national interest, are going to be blamed. So we're not going to miss any opportunity. But at the same time, we all have heard about the sort of conditions that they're talking about, which is not that much of a difference from what we have heard, for example, from the Biden campaign or Joe Biden's advisors during the campaign, what was said about re-entering the JCPOA when Iran is also abiding by its commitments. But there is also something which is being discussed by Iranian officials, and that is the issue of compensation, which is a very vague something which is being brought up here and there by different camps inside the country. What is this compensation? Nobody knows. What is the idea? Nobody knows. If it's an incentive rather than compensation, we don't know. Incentive like, I don't know, an IMF loan, which Iran requested many months ago in light of the very dire situation of the COVID and the pandemic there. It's going to be worse. Next week, Iran is going to finally implement a lockdown. So the economic situation is going to become worse. This we're anticipating. So generally, the mood from Tehran when it comes to the political elite, it's no surprise, though there are those which are acknowledging that maybe negotiating and talking with the Biden administration might be even more difficult, because Biden is going to have Europeans on his side when it comes to JCPOA and other concerns. So there are different sort of colors of reaction, but all in all, it fits in one category, I would say. And then we can continue talking about that, obviously.
Thank you, Hannah. Before I let you go, just a quick question and a quick reply, please, because I know both John and Behna want to talk about this as well. You described the three groups, and one of them just didn't care, and yet they were following the elections carefully, and I understand why, because the outcome of US elections does have an impact regardless of the rhetoric in Tehran. But here's my question to you. What did you sense in terms of how much of the hardliners kind of downplaying the outcome of the US elections is all about jockeying for the Iranian elections of June of next year? That this is already something they're thinking about. How much of that was evident to you, since the prominent voices that are making these claims that US election outcome didn't matter are incidentally people who are likely to be running for the presidency in Iran in June? So how much of that did you see?
It's very important question, because obviously one of the most important things that Iranian officials were looking at the US elections, it was because of this, what you say, that there would be a inevitable impact on the presidential elections in Iran next spring. Very interestingly, I would just refer to one of our reportings of yesterday, that the IRGC outlet yesterday, Sobh Sadegh, recommended that the nuclear file would be brought back to the National Security Council and would be led by somebody like Ali Shamkhani, the council member, to be led by him, which is obviously a very different approach than what we see from Zarif's foreign ministry. The National Security Council obviously never lost its role during the past years when it comes to making decisions about the nuclear file, but the lead negotiators were from this foreign ministry that Javad Zarif was leading. So it shows you how much of a threat, I would say, maybe they would feel that it can boost the image of one camp comparing to the other if one succeeds in a very short time until the presidential elections. If the Iranian public would react to it by increased participation, I'm not sure, because many things have changed in the past 4 years in the public opinion of the Iranians. But the other camp, the camp which really wants to have its own share from such a high-level negotiation, is already feeling threatened, and it's taking action for it.
Thank you, Hannah. Well, I'm sure we get back to that. John, next you're up. So John, I didn't mean to ask you this first question, but I have to, since it was in the news yesterday, and I have my original question ready for you. But let me get your quick reaction to this sort of notion that President Trump was considering strikes against nuclear-related facilities in Iran had to be held back. And one of the things, and I have no way of knowing this is true or not, but one of the motivations in the White House might have been to sort of make life harder for a Biden presidency dealing with Iran going forward. What does that tell you about this sort of state of American foreign policy when during a transition you want the opposite? You want the handover to be smooth on something as sensitive as the Iranian issue. And then we have the news of yesterday. What did you make of it?
I mean, on the one hand, it would have been hard for me to imagine that the president wouldn't want to consider that option. He's certainly considered the option before, not just with the Qasem Soleimani strike, but also the strike that he pulled back on about a year and a half ago. So I think the president is interested in options. I think the way to talk to the president about this, and the way I assume his advisors talk to him, is if you're trying to make your brand, I got out of wars in the Middle East, why are you starting a war in the Middle East that doesn't have a clear endpoint? And I would imagine that's the argument they made, and I would imagine that's the argument that was persuasive. Certainly after the US drone was shot down about 18 months ago, he was thinking of going forward. And when push came to shove at the last moment, he pulled back. And it wasn't because of the casualties on the ground. It was because he just wasn't so sure he wanted to go ahead with it, from what I understand from people who are in the room.
Great. Thank you, John. And here's my question for you. The argument being made that, President Biden-elect, once he's in the White House, he'll be plenty on his plate. Nation building would be his focus. It won't be foreign policy. Others will have to deal with foreign policy. One, what do you make of that argument? And if it is true that he does end up doing some, if you will, strategic vision thinking about the Middle East, where do you think Iran will fit in that worldview of a Biden administration?
It's an interesting set of questions. Yeah, I was a young staffer for Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the Senate, and Joe Biden was the #2 Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee. Joe Biden's been doing foreign policy for a very long time, as much as he thinks it's important to fix the US at home and get ahead of COVID and get the economy moving and everything else. I cannot imagine that he won't think that foreign policy is an important part of being the president, an important part of his agenda, and a place where he has not only a lot of expertise and knowledge, but a lot of relationships. So I don't think that foreign policy is going to fall away. In many ways, foreign policy is going to be a place where he doesn't have to work as closely with Congress, where he can demonstrate some of his skill, where you're going to have the world coming to the United States and saying, thank God we have a partner. How can we build the partnership? In many ways, President-elect Biden is going to be able to draw on the world's relief that the Trump era is over. And that will give him a certain amount of wind at his back in getting people to agree, because people will want to agree. People will think we need to make the United States work with us. We need to make this partnership work. So I think he's going to have a certain advantage. Now, there's a broader question you ask about where the Middle East fits in his worldview. I think the Middle East, he's not a totally Asia-focused person. In many ways, his gut draws him to cooperation with Europe. But Europe is very interested in the Middle East, and Asia is very interested in the Middle East, partly because Asia continues to get so much of its oil from the Middle East. So I think he's going to come into the Middle East from a number of places. It is clear that he thinks that one of the biggest mistakes that the Trump administration has made in foreign policy is not working with allies. And one of the places we're not working with allies is on Iran, where you had a huge global coalition cooperating with the US on Iran under the JCPOA, and the Trump administration has dismantled it. Clearly, the Biden administration is going to try to get into some sort of negotiating process, as you described it at the top. But how you get there is unclear. It's clear he's going to want to get to something like the JCPOA or JCPOA plus, but it seems to me you have several problems on the Iranian side. One is the Iranians feel burned by where the JCPOA process worked. Rouhani advertised that as providing a huge advance for the economy. It hasn't done that. Iranians in many ways are suffering across the board. Second, as you mentioned, as Hannah mentioned, you have the presidential elections, the jockeying before that, people trying to look tough, people trying to look strong before that, and just the complicating factor of, could the Iranians make any sort of deal before the elections for fear of helping a candidate who some of the Central Powers don't want to help? And the third, and this is a part where I'm really a novice compared to the other panelists on the show, my experience with Iranian negotiating behavior, the Iranians always want to use time as a weapon. They never want to make a quick deal. A quick deal shows weakness and desperation. I have seen time and time again, whenever you think you're close, just when you think you're on the brink, the Iranians pull back and say, oh, we're not quite sure, we're not ready, can we get something else? We need something else. So I think those three things are going to make it very hard in the initial months for the US to really change the relationship with Iran. What that means, I think, is first, the Biden administration should show some signals to Iran that this really is a new period, a new approach. Lifting the ban on Iranians coming to the US is an obvious one. We mentioned the IMF agreement, getting the Iranians access to more money to help with medicine and food in the wake of COVID is an important part. And then I think the Biden administration is going to have to work with Europe. Partnership with Europe is going to be key. Europe wants a diplomatic approach. And it seems to me that working through Europe and talking about working through Europe and giving Europe a little more freedom on this will send a signal to Iran so that after we get past the presidential elections, see how that comes out. First, possibly have a result where you have a candidate who really is committed to negotiating come out of that, but then get into a negotiating process. It will be a long negotiating process, but I think getting back into the process is the strategic goal of the Biden administration. And if they have an Iranian partner, I think we can make some progress on that score.
Lots of good points there, John. Thank you. Before I let you go, a very quick question, and I know this is not the kind of question where you can expect a quick answer, but if you had to sort of look at the Gulf states, Israel, Turkey, and Iran, how would you order them in terms of priority for the Biden administration?
It depends what you mean by order, right? I mean, I think that the Biden administration thinks that U.S. interests are going to have to come first. The U.S. has had a very difficult relationship with Turkey, and it's not just in the last several years. It's not just in the last 10 years. I remember Paul Wolfowitz going to Turkey before the Iraq War and trying to get Turkey to behave differently. And the Turkish relationship has become increasingly difficult. The Eastern Med, if you want to talk about that, we can talk about for a long time. The Eastern Med is becoming very complicated. I'm told that President Obama spoke to President Erdogan more than any other leader in the world for a time, and yet there's a sense that Turkey is falling away from a 75-year NATO partnership. Clearly, the Biden administration is going to have a difficult time with Turkey and will have to devote attention to Turkey, but I think you're seeing growing distance between the U.S. and Turkey, and that really dates back for many, many years. The Gulf states, the U.S. still cares about the Gulf. The U.S. is still committed to the Gulf, but I think the Biden campaign has talked a lot about how we have to end a blank check for Saudi Arabia. We have to treat the Gulf states with a little more distance. And there's going to be more distance there. There's no affection for Iran. Iran is a problem. And the question is, what's your approach to Iran? And the Biden administration approach will be, we have to engage rather than merely beat with sticks. So it seems to me that among all those countries, and with Israel, certainly there's, I think, a 45-year Joe Biden history of affection toward Israel as an idea, but there's also many years of tension with Benjamin Netanyahu as a prime minister. So there's going to be a little more distance. I think in many cases, you'll see a change from the Trump administration's policy, which is very driven by personalities, very transactional, very driven by the president wanting to engage. I think you'll see a more full spectrum, holistic approach where the Middle East is a region of challenges. The Middle East is a region where the US has interests it will advance, and no country can count on a blank check from the United States. There will be a reordering, and I think in that process of reordering, as countries want to come to the top of the order, there'll be an incentive to be more conciliatory toward the United States for fear of falling out of favor.
Thank you, John. And Behnam, let's on that note, let's go to Tehran. What are the obstacles for a consensus to be a bit more forthcoming vis-a-vis the Biden administration? When you look at the key actors, the office of the Supreme Leader, the generals in the Revolutionary Guards, the presidential palace, an angry Iranian public that has come out frequently to protest against not just sanctions, but just political repression and a costly foreign policy. Put all that together, what's in the way of a consensus? Either way, it doesn't matter what the consensus is, but what's in the way of a consensus to your mind?
Well, I think we can broaden that out. And Alex, I want to say thank you for a very timely panel. I think there's something that really ties into what Hannah was talking about initially. She talked about different groupings of Iranians inside Iran. And you all know, all of you being foreign policy watchers, Middle East hands, Iran watchers, that there used to be talk of this other group in Iran called Hezbollah, or the Party of the Wind, which is that the great silent majority of the Iranian populace was actually of this Hezbollah. They were actually of this Party of the Wind, ready to go from one side to the other side wherever their interests would be found. That doesn't happen anymore. In fact, nowadays you really have the kind of firm categorization along the lines that you and Hannah talked about. People looking for regime change, people looking for behavior change, people looking for just a little bit more in life. So there is less of that great antipathy that we talk about in the Iranian populace, and there is more of a set preference. And I think whether you're a leader in Tehran or you're a leader in Washington, that kind of set hardened preference of different Iranians, of different social strata is something that you're going to have to deal with. And now, how does that affect, a potential Joe Biden administration? Listen, I think we have to first be very clear about how we talk about a return to the deal. Before we deal with Tehran, let's first deal with Washington. What that means is I don't see an immediate return to the JCPOA. The 2015 Iran nuclear deal is highly likely. In fact, I think the most likely thing we're going to see from the Biden administration, picking up on what John was talking about in some interim relief, is really the conditions that got us the 2013 interim Iran nuclear deal, the JPOA. And in that regard, I think you're likely to see exactly what facilitated that, which is some premature sanctions relief by Washington, either overtly or covertly, to Tehran to try to flesh out if there's any interest, not in solving the Iranian nuclear issue. I think that is too hard to do in the first 6 months, particularly given the fact that some of the Biden folks are actually some of the Obama folks recast. We have the transition team now. We know who's been advising Biden on foreign policy. You've seen the op-eds, the think tank events, the articles. So in that regard, we need to pay attention to who those folks were. And those folks really believed in I like to call it the myth of moderation of Rouhani and Zarif and others. I'm sure people on this panel and watching may disagree. But if you really do believe in that, then you have every incentive to want to bail out the architects of the JCPOA. And how do you do that? You initiate a freeze for freeze. And I think that is the desired outcome for a potential Biden administration, at least for the first 6 months, because you've heard them say in the first 100 days they want to return to the deal. And this is the vehicle that they would have to use, a freeze for freeze, not to solve the Iranian nuclear issue, but to cap it. And that capping is a national security goal that is achieved in its own right. And then how to build on that capping is going to be the challenge for the Biden administration moving ahead. So that's, I think, what they want. Now, what are the impediments to getting what they want? There's plenty. As I said, first, let's discuss Washington. There's a lot of things that Trump can do. One, of course, would be the question you asked, John, if there was a premature military strike, overt or covert, on some of these Iranian facilities, could that impede any Iranian goodwill to want to make a concession? Could that raise the price of what Hannah was talking about, which is, well, you bomb this facility, so you have to pay to rebuild it. Well, you cyber attack this facility, so you have to pay to restore it. There's all these kinds of open-ended questions as Trump's maximum pressure campaign continues. Unless we forget it, it's a campaign that's easy to continue because it's non-kinetic, right? There's no military action being the primary tool. The primary tool is economic. It's coercive. It's punitive. It aims to be deterrent. What else can they do? The Iranians could ask for a higher price there. The Iranians could also continue doing what we've seen them do since May 2019, which is to overtly continue violating the deal in the hope that there is more sanctions relief given, whether that's through the IMF loan, whether that's through even what President Trump talked about when he met with President Macron last summer, which is a kind of a financial channel, perhaps a line of credit. I don't know in the numbers of how many billion. Perhaps that's something that a potential Biden administration may want to offer. Tehran could counter by saying that's not enough. And of course, the issue of linkage. The Biden team is likely to return to the Obama approach, which is a wedding cake kind of approach to the Iranian threat, with the top layer of that wedding cake being the nuclear issue, and underneath that missile, underneath that regional terrorism, cyber, human rights, and the things that have really divorced Iran from the international community. The Trump administration's approach, as you know, was to kind of flatten this wedding cake into a pancake and deal with all the issues at once. I think that's a conceptually more honest approach because one threat really does beget another. But at the same time, solving this pancake is very, very challenging. And it's logistically very complex, as you've seen the Trump administration be frustrated by this all or nothing approach is taken. So given that a Biden administration is going to want to pursue something much more narrow, impediments to that narrow return could be more of what Trump is doing outside the military domain, which is, of course, troop withdrawals. We talk about if a Biden administration wants to return to a nuclear deal, well, it's going to have some kind of deterrent posture in the region to deal with the rest of the Iranian threats. If President Trump is withdrawing troops from the region, that necessarily would hinder that other U.S. foreign policy goal of deterring, containing, or rolling back Iran in the region. So that's one area where something that Trump might do could impede or hurt a Biden administration. It's something that we're seeing now reported in the press quite, repeatedly, and I think we're going to see continue up until, January 20, January 21, is these designations through executive orders on Iran's non-nuclear threats, particularly missile, terrorism, and human rights. You're likely to see those continue. On the terrorism side, these are things that are financially and reputationally sticky, and that could slow any kind of reversal by President Biden to the JPOA process even. It won't impede a financial channel being established. It won't impede premature sanctions relief, but it could impede the return to the JCPOA type sanctions relief, which is the massive banking, business, shipping, because while politics can change on a dime, laws can change on a dime, business and banking reputations and markets don't necessarily change on a dime. And we saw that with the post-JCPOA era in effect in the Iranian economy. Now, to get to the heart of your question, because like any good Iranian American, I took 10 minutes to lay quite an introduction, there are many, 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 many impediments in Iran to that. One, of course, is the supreme leader, and you began at the top. So let's flesh that out. The supreme leader is in the 8th decade of his life, 3rd decade of his career, and he didn't get to that position, 8th decade of his life, 3rd decade of his career, by taking too many risks. He's kept the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution, on this course, and that course has been neither war nor peace with America. That's been a challenging course at times that we've seen with the authorization of the strike in response to the killing of Soleimani. It's taken some risks, but broadly you could say it's been risk averse. The reason it's become risk tolerant in the past couple of years is because they sensed exactly what John mentioned, which is there's not a willingness to follow through on some threats that President Trump has made. And if they sense an administration that is more dovish than the Trump administration and willing to at least offer some of this relief, perhaps the supreme leader might authorize some greater risk tolerance by security forces, by the IRGC in the region, which would make it politically harder and strategically more unsound to be one to relieving financial pressure on Tehran. So the supreme leader could greenlight more Iranian operations abroad. The supreme leader, of course, could also tell the constellation of Iranians that already occupy these positions, whether that's the former Tehran mayor Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who is now the head of the parliament. He has come out against negotiations with America. Or a bunch of other officials like Raisi, who's commented, I think, on this as well, the head of the judiciary. There are a constellation of hardliners in power in Tehran who are personally right now predisposed to dilute the domestic Iranian political consensus building to try to get a deal with America. Remember, when Rouhani was campaigning in 2013, he used this line about trying to talk to America rather than the Europeans to get sanctions relief. And he said, which is rather than kind of deal with the Europeans, we're going to deal with the Americans. And he called the Americans the Lord of the Realm, which is akin to a village chieftain. Rather than villagers negotiating amongst each other, go to the village chieftain because the chieftain has the power. So such arguments, if there's this constellation of hardliners in Iran, particularly based in the parliament after the February 2020 elections, and given the way things are jockeying for the June presidential elections, those arguments will fall on deaf ears. Lest we forget, former Basij commander Mohammad Reza Naqvi talked about what it's like to deal with the Americans after the killing of Soleimani. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, the killing of Soleimani is a direct result of the JCPOA, or the killing of Soleimani is a direct result of negotiations with America. I've seen different versions of this quote in January 2020 of this year. So any faction in Iran who is going to want to talk about getting this thing that a potential Biden administration may want to give, which is that premature sanctions relief or the interim sanctions relief through those methods that we talked about, is going to first have to overcome these domestic hurdles. And Khamenei has done a good job in the past couple of, year and a half, you could say, of making sure that there are politicians in this constellation of power who are predisposed to block those arguments, counter those arguments. And you see these arguments being borne out in the Iranian press every single day. Next, of course, is the presidency itself. And I think we're in a position here for a deja vu moment where Rouhani, as John mentioned, like many other Iranian negotiators, is skilled at playing for time. He did that when he was the secretary of the Supreme National Security Council during the first E3 Iran talks in 2003. That got us the Paris Declaration and the Tehran Accords. And he could do that again. There is this great temptation in the West to mirror image. We have administrations, the Trump the Biden, the Obama, the Bush, and we see them as cleavages or ruptures. There's different foreign policy approaches. But in Iran, there sometimes is more continuity than change within these administrations, because foreign policy isn't necessarily set by the president. Yes, there's substance that's changed. Yes, there's a lot of style that's changed, but the heart of it doesn't emanate from the presidential office.
Right.
It emanates more from these institutions that you mentioned. So in this case, Rouhani may be able to actually play good cop, bad cop, elicit those things that John and Hannah were talking about, buy time, and then one way of possibly resurrecting his reputation and his reputation of his ilk could be handing over that nuclear file to a likely incoming hardline administration, saying, here's the leverage I got you. You berated me since America left the deal in 2018, but we stuck to my approach, which is first strategic patience, then graduated escalation, and now this. So we've gotten these gains, and we've gotten to a position where America wants to return to the deal. Amerika Pashimune, he could say. America is upset by this. It wants to return and make good on a mistake, you could say. And in this world, a Rouhani administration that even is outgoing could play its good cop, bad cop against Washington, and it's something Washington is going to have to be prepared for and offset. And the reason I said deja vu is just like we saw in 2004 and 5, where you had mass discrimination of reformist candidates in the Iranian parliament, leading to a hardline Iranian parliament, ultimately leading to the election of Ahmadinejad, which ultimately permitted him a little bit of room for maneuver inside Iran to escalate the Iranian nuclear program. And then 2006 to 2013 commenced the Iranian nuclear crisis. We have here the same steps, and a Biden administration is going to have to be very, very careful that even if it wants to deal with this narrow issue of the wedding cake, the top tier of the wedding cake, it is going to have to be cognizant of this trend, which is February 2020, hardline parliament. June 2021, likely hardline Iranian president. Could that likely hardline president also touch off a nuclear dispute? I think it's highly likely. And I think that's going to be a significant impediment.
Thank you, Behnam. That was a very comprehensive answer. Thank you. You answered my 5 follow-up questions without. We got about 5 or 6 minutes for the second round, because I want to leave the last quarter of an hour to go through some good questions that are coming through. So let me start with you, Hannah. Look, you could make the argument, Hannah, that Ayatollah Khomeini, before he died, he was basically told by the likes of Rafsanjani that, sir, before you die, you ought to sign the ceasefire with Iraq. You're the only person who can get it done. And he did. Before he died, he did sign that ceasefire, and he made life so much easier for his successor, who became Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of today. Do you detect anything in the statements of Khamenei or people close to him, or in society at large, an attempt to say to Khamenei, you are 81, you might be around for another God knows how long, or you might not be. Maybe you ought to start paving the way for something that starts looking like normalizing relations with the United States, because it's costing the country so dearly, economically, politically, regionally, on all fronts. Do you sense anything like that in the Iranian landscape, sort of paving the way for, as Behnam was talking about, you're passing something workable, even if it's a hardliner, to say, I take the responsibility, but the next generation, you don't need to go through another 40-some years of hostility. Do you sense that, Hannah? Anything like that?
Well, when it comes to Khamenei, I mean, what his people are telling him, you have to ask them. I don't know. But I think one thing is clear, especially given Khamenei's previous decision-making processes and how he decided for certain issues at hand. I think when it comes to the moment that he and the people around him would feel that there is a danger to the Islamic Republic as a whole, they would act. And honestly, when I heard now comments, I was just thinking about it, that yes, there are certain procedures that are being repeated in a sense from this administration in the US to the next, but the situation on the ground is very different today than any other time that we have seen in Iran. There is so many things at the same time happening. People are way more aware of their condition, their position when it comes to their position and rights as a citizen to the state. The state itself knows that its cards are sort of like open now on the table. Everybody knows about the corruption, about the human rights abuses. We cannot just forget about that. People know about all of these things. The economic situation is so dire. The impact of sanctions, now added to it a COVID crisis too. All of these things, when thinking about it, I would not think that this doesn't go around in Khamenei's office that, okay, it might come the time that the nature of this system, the Islamic Republic, is in danger. And that moment are usually the moments that the leaders in the Islamic Republic, namely the supreme leader of Iran, made certain decisions. I would think that that is what's happening right now. But also one has to consider this too. IRGC at the moment, Iran's Revolutionary Guards, they have gained much more power than where they were before, politically, military-wise, as well as economically. And when it comes to all of these aspects, you have to think like, what is IRGC thinking, not only what Supreme Leader of Iran thinking. And what I see from my observations, from our reportings, what I see with IRGC is also the case that there are some more pragmatic commanders out there who are maybe willing to talk, even after the killing of Qasem Soleimani in Iraq. So it's something that the existence of the Islamic Republic is more important than any other thing. Face saving, they would negotiate with the US too.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm going to go to John. John, a quick comment from me, then my question for you. I mean, we shouldn't forget that this is the first anniversary of the killings of hundreds and hundreds. Some reports talk about 1,500 Iranians at the hands of the Islamic Republic just a year ago. So when we talk about nothing has changed, I don't actually, and both John and Behnam talked about maybe buying time, and I'm sure you don't mean it in the context I'm about to speak to it, but how often can you come out and kill hundreds of your own citizens because you can't feed them because of the dire economic conditions? So I'm actually not so convinced time is on their side. And we shouldn't forget to Behnam's wedding cake. I mean, a lot of us out there want the human rights to be at the top of that cake. Iranian people are genuinely suffering. We get stuck in centrifuges and percentage of enriched uranium, and those of us who watch Iran closely, we see what's going on to the people of that country, and it's just, frankly, it breaks your heart. And speaking to that, John, things that have changed. A lot has changed in the region, in the Middle East. I mean, you now talk about the Abraham Accords and all the rest of it. So can you have anything that looks like the original JCPOA going forward that can actually be sustained? Or are we going to settle for another agreement that is on executive order basis, or at least will last for 4 years, and God knows what comes after that? Or if you want the US Congress, since you spoke about the Congress in your first set of answers, how can you have a deal that actually can be sustained, that's not just limited to the nuclear issue, that broadens the conversation, that's more likely to have more supporters in the US Congress, or if not American society? And how do you convince the Iranians, for the sake of their interest, if they're interested in keeping the agreement alive, that they should be willing to broaden the conversation? And last point, maybe the Europeans have a role to play in that. Maybe they can push the Iranians and say, it's about time you had a hard look in the mirror and realize what the problem is. And you can't just pick and choose when it comes to talking to your adversaries, like in this case, the US. Sorry, John, too much.
There are a lot of questions wrapped up. Do I have what, 90 minutes to answer them? I think you captured a really important piece of this, which is, what does the solution look like from the perspective of the leadership of the Islamic Republic? And I think that partly there's this question of, where is Congress going to be? And how do you deal with a Congress that is deeply hostile across the board to Iran? Right. And how do you deal with the possibility that you'll have an ex-president who is as hostile to Iran as Donald Trump has been? Mm-hmm. And I think that gives the Iranians a lot of pause, but in some ways it reinforces what, in my experience, is a consensus in the Iranian leadership, which is that the United States is an irredeemably hostile force to the Islamic Republic. And what I saw in Rouhani is not that Rouhani is a moderate, but Rouhani believed that hostility had reached a level under Ahmadinejad that it really detracted from Iranian national interest. But the underlying hostility, I think, is the fact that it exists is a consensus in the Iranian leadership. And that has to govern where this is going to be going forward. I am skeptical that we're going to be able to create a beautiful wedding cake the way Behnam talks about. I don't think we're getting a wedding cake. We might have a few past appetizers here and there. I don't think we're at the cake part of the wedding. I'm not sure we'll get to the cake part of the wedding. But it does seem to me that there's a broader problem, which you highlighted, which is how do you get this into a diplomatic channel and out of a military channel? My concern about the military channel, and Behnam seems not to share it, but my concern is if you push this into a military framework and it's about security and it's about terrorism and all those things, the Iranians will have innumerable cheap ways to score little wins, and they will continue to pick away. They'll pick away at the Emirates, they'll pick away at Saudi Arabia, and they'll pick away at Yemen, and they'll pick away in Syria and Lebanon and other places. And you will have a sustained conflict, but you won't solve the problem. To me, what we're going to need is a web of agreements that will involve necessarily Europe, that will involve Russia and China, that will involve the Gulf states, that will involve different parties for different parts of the agreement, different aspects, whether it's ballistic missiles, whether it's terrorist activities, whether all the different things, and certainly the nuclear file, and you'll have to put these together. I'm not sure we're going to have the perfect deal. I don't know who the president of Iran is going to be in 6 months' time, but my sense is we have to think of a policy of accretion, and we have to look at managing this problem. And the more we think we're going to have a grand agreement that will solve the problem, which I don't think the JCPOA sought to do at all, but the more people take the grand agreement as the goal, I think the more it will seem to be receding. The JCPOA was intended, as you know, as a first step in a whole series of confidence building measures that will allow an expansion of the agenda between Iran and the other parties. I think we have to get back to something where you start small and you try to build out, and you have relatively limited ambitions in the near term, because the problem is too hard to solve, especially if you take into account that the Iranian leadership, I think across the board, has a consensus that this is an existential battle where the US is irredeemably antagonistic to the Islamic Republic. And as you suggest, that may be for good reasons, but it's still going to govern how they respond.
Thank you so much, John. So I'm going to start with the first question for Behnam. There are two questions, Behnam. I'll put them together. If you could give me a quick answer, appreciate it, so we can go through. We have about over 10 minutes. The Biden administration, if they have a new agreement with Iran, what could there be in that new deal that wasn't there in 2015? Number one, and this is something John talked about. The question is saying that to have a new successful nuclear deal, you're going to have to engage Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and the missiles, and the Iranian long-distance missiles. So actually, it's a bit of broader question than I thought, but just see if you can tackle the two, or you can just take the one. What should there be in a new deal that wasn't there in 2015?
Okay, great question. And just a quick footnote to what John said. I would love the wedding cake approach. I would love the wedding cake as is. The only issue is that I built the wedding cake up because those are previous tiers of Iranian threats that are being ignored or forsaken just because of our hyper focus on that top tier. Just like a couple could save the top tier and eat it again on their first anniversary. Since 2002, I think Washington has myopically focused on that top tier to the expense, to the detriment of those bottom tiers. So I think it's a more worthwhile approach to pursue them all together, but I'm fully cognizant of those challenges. And I think because of the incentive to manage, as John was talking about, these crises, we're taking these one tier at a time. I think that is conceptually a little bit more dishonest because one threat begets another. It's the same actors, and we have the same tools to address these threats. It's basically economic sanctions. Unless you're willing to deliver premature sanctions relief in pallets of cash, or again, move into the domain that John was talking about that I think we all agree is not ideal, but somehow has to be incorporated, which is the military and security domain, your primary tool to incentivize compliance for compliance, which is at the heart of the Biden approach to any kind of deal, is going to be sanctions relief. So delivering relief only for one tier of the cake is a grand mistake in my view. I think what is going to be in the content of a deal, I think, is going to be if this approach of first capping the Iranian nuclear program is taken, then there actually won't be much. It'll be restrictions on Iran's domestic stockpile, things of that nature, with a framework to address other issues such as ballistic missiles. I actually don't think a Biden administration is going to be addressing Iran's regional approach the way we talk about it. In fact, I think you've even had Jake Sullivan talk about a regional conference where the US could play a supporting role or a facilitating role. Such a conference is basically ripe to have Iran engage in coercion before, during, and after the conference to bully its way through any kind of diplomatic channel, if it even engages to that. So I think the content of any interim deal is going to be exactly that, quite small, with an intention to tack on other things only as they relate to the nuclear domain. So ballistic missiles is going to be very interesting because they're set to replicate the Trump era mistake. I was a big supporter of the October 2017 to May 2018 attempt by Washington to bridge the transatlantic gap and fix the Iran nuclear deal. But the administration in that fix narrowly scoped, too narrowly in my view, how they would bring on ballistic missiles. And you had then Special Representative Brian Hook talking about preventing Iran from getting ICBMs. I think you need to address the whole class of Iranian ballistic missiles, nuclear capable and not. And that is an exceptionally high price because those are tools of coercion, deterrence, punishment. They're warfighting tools, nuclear delivery tools. And so it's going to be very, very hard. And because it's going to be very hard, I think the Biden administration is going to scope it out and only address classes of systems that Iran doesn't have or have ranges established, upward caps for select Iranian systems that are designed to be able to deliver nuclear weapons. So I think an interim deal is actually not going to do very much for Washington other than restrict the growth that could feed into the one thing that they seem to care about, which is Iran's nuclear breakout timeline.
Thank you, Behram. Hannah, let me ask you this question. There are reports this week that the Iranians and European companies and officials are trying to set up a meeting to sort of prepare the ground, if you will, for once the Biden administration is in. I guess some people are assuming that there will be a quick return to the conditions we had in early 2016 when the sanctions were first lifted, and you might have the opportunity for your European business to sort of go back to Iran. And I think it was Behram or maybe John, but the problem surely is bigger than that. And the Iranians know that. Iran's economy is not just suffering because of the sanctions. And even if the sanctions are removed, what do we do with things like the Financial Action Task Force, the lack of banking facilities and all the rest of it? Some of it will be fixed. The big countries that purchase oil like South Korea, India will be forced to give Iran the money. But overall, what do you think is sort of the sense of awareness and appreciation that to fix the Iranian economy, you're looking at just American sanctions being removed? It's just you, as hardliners in Iran say it, as you know in Persia, you're giving the wrong address to find a solution. What do you think of that?
The conference which you mentioned is actually organized by the European Union as one of those promises of after the JCPOA to encourage business with Iran, especially SMEs. It's true, especially FATF have been a very big hurdle, a very big obstacle. And it's actually a few days ago, I've seen some reporting, some signaling that the issue with the FATF might be again coming back on the table to be reviewed and so on. How much is that true? How much Iran would be ready to do that? Yes, that is one of the biggest issues here. But what we saw with the financial sector was also a very much of a psychological situation out there in the market. For example, as much as the maximum pressure campaign started to get stricter and stricter, we saw businesses in Iran becoming smaller and smaller, and even smaller businesses in private sector started to have difficulties. Added to all of these, I want to mention one issue which we didn't mention at all, and that is the issue of the dual nationals which have been arrested in Iran throughout these years. And the issue of dual nationals is also very important and very much of a problem, let's say, because the issue of dual nationals is always in the minds of the Europeans and also Americans when it comes to talking to Iran. And once you don't have those dual nationals or foreign nationals of France, the UK, today Germany and other countries, when this issue is not solved, whatever attempt when it comes to financial market is going to have challenges and problems. But I think it's just a question of how the environment is going to develop in the coming months when it comes to the international community's approach towards Iran, when it comes to US's approach towards Iran, to see how that financial sector is going to develop and if it's going to be changing course and started to boom again.
Thank you, Hannah. We've got about less than 5 minutes. I got two more questions, starting with John, and then Behnam, you can finish us off. John, two questions. One is about Iraq. What do you think the Biden administration's policy towards Iraq will be, and what does that mean for the pro-Iran militias? I mean, it seems to me the Iranians and the U.S. have decided, and early on in 2020, we're talking about all-out war. And then they decided to de-escalate. Neither Washington, Tehran wanted to go there. But could that change? I mean, what do you think of a Biden-Iraq policy? And the other question for you, John, is about Israel. What do you think the Prime Minister Netanyahu has in terms of, tools in the toolbox, if you will, to shape Biden administration's Iran policy?
With Iraq, a president like Biden was responsible for Iraq policy for part of the Obama administration. He knows a lot of people. He's thought about the issues. He knows the issues. At the same time, there's a commitment the U.S. can't go back into Iraq. I think Iraq, in addition, is having a whole series of large problems. The Iranian-supported militias are just a small piece of that. So to my mind, the hard thing he's going to have to do is, if you're not going to be entirely focused on security issues in the Middle East, if you have more domestic energy and you're less concerned with energy security globally, but you still have this European and Asian focus on Middle Eastern energy, you've got an Iran issue that you're trying to work with. How do you manage the Iraq problem? I think the US is going to try to be helpful, but there are certainly going to be limits, and even limits compared to the Obama administration's strategy toward Iraq going forward in the Biden administration. Iraq, for a lot of reasons, including the lower price of oil, is going to have a very rough time over the next few years. I think they know that the U.S. is not going to be a savior. I think their hope is the U.S. will be more of a partner than they've often found the Trump administration to be. But certainly, as we look broadly at the region, Iraq is one of the places where I could see a lot of turmoil over the next 5 years, partly because of COVID, partly because of economic problems driven by lower oil prices, and partly because of the very messy environment that Iran contributes to in the region. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has a number of options, as any Israeli prime minister does. But again, I think he has a problem guiding Israelis toward a different place with the US president. It's going to be a very different place than he had with President Trump. But I think he's not going to be able to play the way he did with President Obama, where Obama was widely vilified, and there are pictures of Obama in a keffiyeh and all those things. There's a racist undertone to the way that Israelis treated President Obama. You can't do that with Joe Biden because he spent 36 years in the Senate and was a friend of Israel. I think he's not going to be vilified. And so Netanyahu's going to have a harder time positioning himself vis-a-vis the US president, because he'll have to explain the distance. He'll try to close the distance. And I think President-elect Biden is going to artfully play that because he knows the vocabulary, he knows the issues. I think you will see an interestingly different relationship. You will not see a hostile relationship, but you'll certainly have something very, very different from what you had in the Trump administration. Part of the Trump administration's relationship really wasn't driven so much by the president. It was driven by the US ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, who is committed to supporting the settlement movement and a whole series of other things. I think even taking that foot off the gas on the side of the US embassy in Israel is going to change the way the US government engages with Israel. Again, still very, very supportive. Congress is very, very supportive. But the Trump administration relationship with Israel has been extraordinary from a US historical perspective. I think we're going to return to something that's more historically in line with what we've seen before.
Thank you, John. And Behnam, you get the last word. And I got a couple of questions. I group them in together. And I think I'm going to sort of summarize for you what the questions are. Basically, if maximum pressure campaign was all about sticks and very few carrots for Iran, going forward, and if you want to go on a different track, what can you do to look forward to, or moments where you can create confidence building with the Islamic Republic? And you can take anything you would like to raise, but the question specifically was talking about, things you can do in the realm of science, cooperation that are technical instead of, rooted in geopolitics and so forth. So give us something on that front if you think anything is possible on that front.
I'm a little more skeptical of offering Iran carrots outright. Obviously, I think the Biden administration is going to be in a better position to re-up some of the things that the Trump administration has already done, which is to broaden the humanitarian exemptions through the Treasury Department that already exist in US law on sanctions, be very public about broadening those exemptions while retaining those restrictions, because the predicate, which is Iranian bad behavior for those sanctions, has not changed. So I see no reason to actually lift them prematurely. But again, I think the broadening, the redefining, Treasury issuing more guidances, that's something I think we might be able to look forward to. John, again, when he spoke, mentioned something very important. Perhaps it gets more to the issue of dual nationals, Iranian Americans, expatriates, diaspora, but also Iranians who simply want to travel more. And again, to go back to Rouhani, when he campaigned in 2013, one of Rouhani's promises way back in, I think, the spring of 2013 was to restore dignity to the Iranian passport. Now, we know the Islamic Republic has done much to denigrate that dignity, reputationally, financially, and whatnot. But I think, again, removing the travel ban should be really at the top of the list for a potential Biden administration. These are goodwill gestures, I think, that'll help the Iranian people. Unfortunately, they're not going to carry much water with this state. I do see a clear cleavage, and this was evident in some of Rouhani's earlier writings, too. And again, I think he's one of the more sober kind of individuals who thinks about national security differently than others inside the Islamic Republic, for instance. But he still has talked about regime interests and the primacy of language as it relates to regime interest over national interest. So those things which could be seen as little carrots are actually not going to be able, in my view, to manifest themselves as confidence building measures. The reason I support more sticks than carrots is not a domestic partisan reason. It's a historical reason, meaning that the Islamic Republic and America are on opposite sides on one another in terms of being status quo or revolutionary powers in the region. The Islamic Republic has only seldom done a 180 on key national security issues, and you got to the heart of it with the Iran-Iraq war. The goal for a Biden administration is to look at those historical instances, like the Iran-Iraq war, like everything else, and see under what conditions has Iran done this 180. And I would posit to you that there are conditions of more sticks than carrots. And keeping that in the mind as the potential Biden administration discusses sanctions relief and discusses, I think, which again, would be smaller carrots, but ultimately won't lead to what we want, is going to help result in a more sober, nuanced policy discussion. Again, if the political incentive triumphs and you simply want to do the opposite of your predecessor, I think we're headed down a very tough road with Tehran. But at least this can add some more nuance to the debate here, which is to think about under what conditions does Iran change or alter its foreign and security policy, to realize how few they are in the past 41 years. And to think about exactly what you said, which is under what conditions can you get Khomeini's successor, to drink from the poison chalice?
Wow. If you put it in that way, I figure we're not going to go anywhere. But thank you for that. That was wonderful. Thank you all. I want to thank all of you with the questions you sent. I apologize that I wasn't able to go through all the questions, but thank you for all the good questions you sent. Hannah Kaviani, thank you very much. John Alterman, thank you. And Behnam Taleblu, thank you also very much for joining us today. This was a wonderful 1 hour session, just a few minutes over 1 hour. I enjoyed it. I'm sure everybody who watched this enjoyed. We learned a lot. And thank you again all for watching it. Thank you for joining us, the panelists. And I hope you come back and we can do this again at some point soon. Thank you and have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.